Next, we have Professor Craig Haney, who's going to tell us a bit about the development of what we see now in our culture. Professor Haney is going to talk about from the Stanford prison experiment to Supermax prisons and back again, changing the narrative in criminal justice reform. He's a professor of law and psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Thank you.
Thank you, Bree. And thank you for this opportunity and honor to address this esteemed group and the legislators from Oregon. I spent 2 separate times in Oregon, or in Norway with Oregonians, and I'm delighted to be able to talk a bit about some of the things that the Norwegians have taught us. Oregon is really one of the success stories of this program. Really one of the communities that came back and have really implemented what it is that the Norwegians were trying to impart to all of the people who were in Norway with us. I want to talk about where we have been over the last 40 years in the United States, as a way of underscoring how far we have fallen, to be frank with you, and how far we have to go, not necessarily in Oregon, but in Oregon too. And talk a little bit about an aspect of how we have changed as a society, not just as prison systems, but as a society, as a result of what has come to be called the era of mass incarceration in the United States. Because I think it's changed not just how we do corrections, but it's changed how we think about crime and punishment and each other. And what I'm going to end on is the note that until and unless we change that, it will be very difficult for there to be the creation of justice, the maintenance of justice, or the reinvestment in justice. My hosts have asked me to begin by talking about some events that took place almost 50 years ago. When I was in elementary school, honest. Philip Zimbardo and Curtis Banks and I conducted an experiment, which has come to be known as the Stanford prison experiment. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. You've seen it or heard about it in one form or another, not always honestly represented in the media, but it was an experiment in which we were attempting to understand the dynamics of imprisonment, and to understand it in a way that allowed us to look as best we could at the essence of what it meant to be in prison. And we tried to eliminate from the experiment the kinds of explanations that are ordinarily used to explain why prisoners act the way they do and correctional staff act the way they do, namely in terms of the personality characteristics or tendencies and habits of both different groups of people. And the way we did that was to bring into that environment a group of volunteers, people who volunteered, college students who volunteered to be part of this prison experiment, study done in the summer of 1971 in Stanford, California. And we gave those volunteers, it was a large group of people who volunteered, we gave them a battery of psychological tests, we did psychiatric interviews with them, we selected out of the 75 people who volunteered the 20 most normal people. They were the people who scored in the most normal, healthy range of all of the psychological tests that we gave them. They were abnormally normal, if you will. And we did this because we wanted to eliminate personality explanations from whatever events transpired in the study. So these were normal people by all of the dimensions that we could measure, and then we randomly assigned them to one role or another. They were either assigned randomly, literally by a flip of the coin, to be prisoners or to be, and we used the term in those days because that was the term that was used, guards. We don't use that term anymore, and appropriately so, but we used it in those days. Half of the 20 became prisoners, the other half became guards, or our student correctional officers. We dressed the correctional officers in uniforms. We gave them some of the props of correctional officers at the time. We put prisoners in uniforms. We were functionally simulating a prison, so we put prisoners in uniforms that made them feel somewhat powerless, somewhat awkward, not necessarily secure in the environment where they were. We gave both groups of people relatively little instructions about what to do. We had an orientation meeting with the guards the day before, in which they talked a bit with each other about how they would approach what was ahead of them. And they began the next day, after the prisoners had been actually arrested by the Palo Alto Police Department, brought to what we called the Stanford County Prison, which was an environment we had created in the basement of the psychology department. And the study began. Zimbardo and Banks and I did everything we could to stay out of it. We were there to observe. We were there to collect data. Every once in a while, we got involved in a few interactions, but for the most part, it was the students who enacted the prison. And to be perfectly frank with you, we were not sure what was going to happen. I say that to people all the time, and they don't believe that we couldn't have predicted or anticipated what was going to take place, and I can tell you very honestly, we didn't. And I can also tell you very honestly, there was no way for us to know what was going to happen. It seems now, in retrospect, like it might have been obvious, but I assure you it was not obvious at the time. If it had been, we wouldn't have put ourselves right in the middle of that environment, because I think that is the one ethical mistake we made. We were affected by the environment that we had created, and we hadn't anticipated how powerful it would become. The guards began almost immediately in this environment to enact the role of what they thought guards or correctional officers would do and would be. And in many systems around the country, notwithstanding the good training that correctional officers in Oregon get, in other places they don't get such good training, and lots of times actual correctional officers will tell you that's what they do. They try to act like they think a guard or a correctional officer is supposed to act, and that's what our students did. But they were tested almost immediately when the prisoners in the study reacted. They rebelled. They were not happy about the conditions of their confinement and how they were being treated 24 hours into the study. Our student guards then reacted in an unpredictable way. We had no idea what they would do. We had decided beforehand if prisoners did something like the prisoners did on the first day, we were going to stay out of it. We were going to let our guard staff deal with it in whatever way they thought was appropriate. They immediately called in reinforcements. So instead of 3 of the students on duty, they called all of the rest, the whole 10, they called them in to put down the prisoner rebellion. And the tactics that they used were very dramatic. They took a fire extinguisher, began to shoot the fire extinguisher into the cells to subjugate the prisoners. And from that point on, that environment became as much like a real prison as any real prison I have ever seen since. Again, much to Zimbardo's and my great surprise. The prisoners from that point on were mistreated by the staff. Sometimes they were mistreated in ways that the correctional staff went to great lengths to prevent Zimbardo and Banks and I from knowing about. So they escorted the prisoners to the restrooms. We didn't have bathrooms in the cells, so whenever a prisoner had to go to the bathroom, they had to be taken out of the prison area. And we learned later, after the study was over, that one of the things they did was to abuse them in the bathrooms, so, out of our sight, out of our presence. We had a closet in the hallway that we said that could be used as solitary confinement, but for no longer than an hour. And we learned after the study was over that the guards had conspired, the student guards had conspired to leave someone in overnight, again, without our knowledge. We were shocked and amazed at how realistic and how extreme the study became and how quickly it became so extreme and so cruel. We should have intervened. I fully admit we should have intervened early. The study was designed to go 2 full weeks. We ended it after 6 days. Frankly, in retrospect, we should have ended it after 36 hours. After the changes that took place were so sudden, so dramatic, so unexpected. These were all people who I had interviewed before they went into the study. So I was in more shock than anybody else, than any of the other 2 experimenters, because I felt like I knew these guys. And it was unsettling to see how rapidly they had changed. And how quickly they began to abuse the limited amount of power which they had been given in this environment. We lost our first prisoner 36 hours into the study. I was on duty that night, and I went away into the town of Palo Alto to get something to eat, and I came back, and they said one of the prisoners had broken down and was demanding to be released, and it was inconceivable to me that that would take place in 36 hours into the study. And I sat down with him, and he was in grave emotional distress, and I made an executive decision to release him, to send him home. I couldn't reach Zimbardo. He was in another town. And so I did it myself. We let him go. And then in the next several days, several other prisoners broke down. And again, nothing we had anticipated, nothing we had even planned for. It never occurred to us that this environment would become this powerful and this painful in such a short period of time. By the end of the study, 6 days into the study, we had lost 3 prisoners who had emotional breakdowns, had to be released. And the ones who weren't released were in bad shape, and it was obvious to us that we needed to end the study. The study had an enormous impact, not just on the prisoners, as I said, several of whom had broken down and been released from the study, but when we did a debriefing after the study was over, perhaps not surprisingly to you, it was our student correctional officers who were also very emotionally traumatized by what had happened. Not what they had felt necessarily in the course of the study itself, but now as they reflected on it after the fact, they had a hard time coming to terms with what they had done. And we spent a long time, really a longer time with the guards than we spent with the prisoners, debriefing them and making sure they were okay in the aftermath of the study. We videotaped a lot of what went on in those days. In 1971, videotape technology was a cutting edge technology, and so we thought we'd being very scientifically advanced by videotaping a lot of what had the interactions that took place, and then we carefully analyzed the videotape afterwards, and what we found was this unsettling pattern. We had seen it, but when we were able to measure it, it was even more striking. The correctional officer guards engaged in commands and insults and aggression and order giving and so on and so forth, and the prisoners did very little in the way of behaving. They asked questions, they pushed back a little bit, but this was an environment that was really very much dominated by the correctional staff. Again, people who were identical in all respects. They were college students, and they knew that the prisoners had committed no crimes, but really were prisoners only because a coin had been flipped and come up heads rather than tails, or they themselves could have been prisoners. I spent a lot of time thinking about this study in the aftermath of it. I was a graduate student, and it had a tremendous transformative effect on me. I drew 5 simple lessons from it. These are not, they're simple lessons, but I want to share them with you because I think they're applicable to some of the things we're going to talk about today. And the first one, this is really the essence or the core of why we did this study. In very powerful situations, our thoughts and actions are shaped by the context in which they occur. Much more than we like to think. We tend to think of ourselves as captains of our own destiny and making choices and doing things as a reflection of who we are. And many times in our life, that's the case. But when we enter especially powerful situations, what makes those situations powerful is their ability to change us, to get us to do things that we otherwise wouldn't do. And prison, obviously, this is the second simple lesson, is a supremely powerful environment. And it shapes the thoughts and the actions of the people who are inside of it. It shapes them in very significant way. Those young boys did things in that environment that they had never done before and that they would never do after, but they did them because they were in that prison or prison-like environment. I learned also, and this is something that I've kept with me for a long period of time, that even in a minimalist prison, and this was as minimalist a prison as you could create, the psychological pains of imprisonment are very real and they are very substantial. They're very real and they're very substantial for the prisoners and the staff, although almost no one, not the prisoners or the staff, talk about them. In different ways, then, the prison environment affects the staff at least as much and often as painfully as it does the prisoners. And I'm a psychologist, and I work in the area called psychology and law, and I spend a lot of time studying prisons. And most of what has been written about prisons has been written about how prisoners are affected by it. But I know, and some of my now friends from Norway and friends from Oregon, we know that correctional officers are profoundly affected by these environments as well, even though it's studied very little in the United States. And finally, a kind of basic lesson, left unchecked, the core dynamics of prison tend towards dehumanization and mistreatment. When a group of people is given absolute or near absolute power over a group of derogated others, nothing good is likely to happen. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do something about it. That doesn't mean that every single prison has to devolve into what happened in the Stanford prison experiment. But it means that if left to its own devices, that's the dynamic which has been created. And I suppose there's a sixth lesson, which I had no way at the time of the prison study of knowing, and that is that the dynamic of prisons and that mentality in a society which has committed itself, as ours did over the last 40 years, to what's come to be called mass imprisonment, is at risk of itself being affected by that dynamic, even if you don't work in prison. And that's the point I want to get to a little bit later. And that's really what that dynamic looks like. It looks like people taking advantage of other people suffering, and a very unhealthy interactional pattern taking place. And again, left to its own devices, which is what we did in the Stanford prison experiment, that is what you have every reason to expect will evolve, or the place will devolve into. Now, I went on from that study to look at real prisons, and it turns out the very first one I looked at was north of here in the state of Washington, but I went on to look at prisons and study prisons and how people react to prisons in lots of other states across the country. And I began this work right after the prison study was done. We did the prison study in 1971, and this is a graph of the number of people in prison in the United States and the rate of incarceration in the United States up to 1971 at the moment we did that study. I won't go into detail in the interest of time, but you can reflect on the fact that it is a stable rate of incarceration over a 50-year period of time. There's a blip, that little spike is around the Great Depression. A little bit more people went to prison during the Great Depression, but otherwise it's a stable line. And what you can tell from this graph is it's a line of about 100 per 100,000 incarcerated in the United States. A rate roughly approximating the rate of incarceration in many European countries, still much higher than Norway. But up until 1971, the United States we were not an outlier necessarily in comparison to the rest of the world. We weren't leading the world in low rates of incarceration, but we weren't leading in high rates either. And I actually thought that, based in part on the insights we developed from the prison study, that we could do better than that. We could take that rate down. That it had stayed stable for a very long period of time, but now in 1971, I thought we knew a lot more about the dangers of incarceration in 1971 than we knew back in 1925 or 1940 or 50 or 60. And we could take that rate down. Never trust me about predicting the future. Because, of course, as you all probably know, this is what happened instead. Rather than that rate going down, it doubled again, and and continued to increase. So I've stopped it here at 2001. As you know, the incarceration rate continued. We have over 2 million, not 200,000 as we had in 1971, 2 million people in prison. And we have a rate of incarceration in the neighborhood of 700, not 100 persons per 100,000. As you know, we accomplished that, if indeed it was an accomplishment, by changing policies. They were political decisions. This is not the time or place to excavate the explanations for why and how it happened or who was at fault. Just let me say, this is what happened to us and what happened to us as a society. These are the policies we followed. And we didn't just put lots and lots of people in prison. We changed the nature of imprisonment, and we changed what we did to people when they were in prison. We began to militarize our perspective on crime control, explicitly so. We fought a war on crime, a war on drugs, and we fought them in some ways literally like a war, rather than dealing with people as if they were our citizens who we expected to return to our communities. We fought them as if they were the enemy. And we created environments that were appropriate for enemies. And we had weapons inside the facilities appropriate for the physical subjugation of people inside. This is the unpleasant part of the talk, because this is what mass incarceration looked like inside. There are people in the room who know this from firsthand experience, but others of you have read about it, and perhaps you've seen it. We put people in cells so inhospitable that it was difficult for people to continue to live in them. That's also what mass incarceration meant. And sometimes we crammed them into environments that were psychologically and medically unhealthy and dangerous, and we left them there for long periods of time. We devised new ways of stacking them so that we could put more people in smaller spaces. We put them in cages. Cages are ubiquitous in the landscape of American prisons now. Cages inside and outside exist in these environments where we put people, where we cage people, often cage them, and they will tell you they feel like animals in these cages. We chain them together. We put them on dog leashes. Prisons became the default placement of the mentally ill in our society, but the mentally ill fared no better in these places. We put the mentally ill there, but we did not treat them as if they were mental patients. And in fact, oftentimes they were left to deteriorate alone in their cells or be placed in solitary confinement or Supermax prisons. Most prison systems in the United States have a disproportionate number of mentally ill people in their segregation units. Segregation units that look like storage facilities for inanimate objects, and inside where people are suffering, whether they're mentally ill or not. When a society increases the number of people it puts in prison the way we did over the last 40 years, something else happens. Something else happens to us as a society. Things happen in prison, and I've shown you that. But in order to do that, in order to do all of that, the society has to change its way of thinking about the people we put in prison. Because you can't really do all the things I just showed you to people who you think about as your neighbor, as your son, as your father, as your brother. We began to change our ideas. We began to shape a different vision of who went to prison. We were aided and abetted in this by the mass media. So it's a little hard to measure all that, but let me measure it through showing you some imagery that you've all been exposed to. This is the way our ideas about crime and criminality and the people who go to prison were changed by the messages and the images we've been given over the last 40 years. Sometimes people who commit crime are depicted as not human. They're called monsters. We explain crime by adverting to something that in the past only religious officials talked about: evil. And we've speculated that people are just born bad. And when you're born bad, after all, what do we owe you and what can we do for you? Now note, these are 3 mainstream magazines. Even the Smithsonian magazine got into this narrative over the last 40 years. It is part of what allowed us to do what we did in the prison system in the United States. And there's so many images, I've shown you only a couple. I won't go through all the sub-narratives that were developed over the years. There are just too many of them, but they all point in the same direction. They derogated, they dehumanized, and they demonized people who committed crime, and enabling us to do all of those other things which I showed you to them when we incarcerated them and put them in prison. We created terms. Some of you may remember this case. We created the term wilding to refer to a group of young African American and Latino boys between the age of 14 and 17 who were accused in the press and by the prosecutors of having engaged in a horrible crime, a horrible, vicious crime in Central Park. And with publicity like this, not surprisingly, they were very quickly convicted and sent to prison. They did between 7 and 14 years in prison until they were exonerated. Every single one of them was exonerated. But not until the language of Wolfpack and wilding had made its way into the vernacular of the way people thought about juvenile violent crime in the 1980s and 1990s. And we turned this lens on our children and created a term super predator to talk about juvenile lawbreakers. This was a term that was prominent throughout the 1990s. You remember famously in the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton was pilloried for having used this term in the mid-1990s when she was campaigning for her husband. But she was using a term that was being used by the press and by lots of folks in the mid-1990s to refer to juvenile lawbreakers. And we made up other kinds of terms as well. Park Dietz, the self-described father of forensic psychiatry, gave an interview to Psychology Today in which he said his work involved him dancing with devils, working with monsters and misfits, and he was an expert. And this is not old news. This is from a Republican National Committee advertisement from last year about why we needed to build a wall in the United States because people like criminal defendant Luis Bracamontes would come across the border, and he was, after all, pure evil. And we needed the wall in order to keep pure evil out of the country. In a certain sense, this is the archetype of the images that we've been given over the last 40 years, all put together in an artist's rendition, not just of Hannibal Lecter, but a kind of an archetype of what we've been led to believe criminality is about. And as long as that is the archetype with which people are still working, and the residue of that archetype is still with us, it will be difficult for us to create justice, to maintain justice, or to reinvest justice. It's not just what we do in our facilities and how we change them and the procedures that we use. It is something that we have to do about how we think about these issues and how we think about the people who are most directly affected by the policies and the places we create. Now we're delighted to have with us our friends from Norway who are going to teach us, among other things, about how to break down that stereotype, about how to stop the derogation, stop the dehumanizing, and stop the demonizing. And they have a whole series of principles which they are going to educate us about today. And I've had the good fortune of being there with them several times and learned a great deal from them, and had an opportunity to be twice, as I said earlier, with Oregon, and to watch them grow and develop and think about these things and come back here and implement them. And you'll hear about the principles that the Norwegians use. You already heard about some of them already this morning. You heard already from your legislator about the principle of normality. And I think in a certain sense that's the core fundamental principle. But I actually want to suggest to you that there's even a more fundamental, more core principle that I think is so intuitive to the Norwegians that they have not pulled it out and labeled it a principle, because to them it is common sense. It is not common sense to us, and I think it needs to be highlighted. And our friend, the deputy governor from the Halden prison, actually, I looked through the literature to try to find somebody articulating this, and he articulates it as well as anybody does. He says, these are people like you and I with feelings, ambitions, and dreams in life. That's the principle of humanity. And to my mind, it is more fundamental even than the principle of normality. Normality says a prison should run as much like normal life as it can. But to do that, you have to begin with the assumption that the people who you are working with, it's a basic and fundamental assumption, these are people like you and I with feelings, ambitions, and dreams in life, and deserve to be treated that way. The Norwegians teach us that without saying it very often and without even articulating it as its own separate principle. But it is a principle. It's a principle that we need to get back to in the United States. Sadly, we've lost our grasp of it. In order to do justice creation, in order to do justice maintenance when we've created it, in order to do justice reinvestment, we need to have that principle firmly in our minds and firmly in our hearts. And the Norwegians and your own correctional officers from the Oregon system are here to work with us today to get us closer to that endpoint. Thank you.